Hello, everybody. My name is James Agnew, aka In Philosopher's Garb. I'm a Christian theologian, and today I'm going to be critiquing a short clip that Gavin Ortlund recently put out about the Canaanite Conquest and also just kind of talk about some war text in general. Many of you might know that it's a common criticism of Christianity to object to the faith on the charge that God commanded genocide against the Canaanites in the Old Testament. This is something that I've been thinking about recently because a lot of the arguments that are being put forth by guys like Gavin Ortlund, Inspiring Philosophy, Paul Copan, I think these are bad arguments. I don't think they really succeed. And it just happens to be that, this video popped up in my feed, and I thought it would be a good way for me to express kind of my grievances with how internet apologists are dealing with this argument. So a couple of preliminary remarks. I have nothing against Gavin personally. In fact, I've watched a good bit of his content. I think he has a lot of great stuff. I actually picked up his book relatively recently and thought it was quite good. I've even recommended some of Gavin's content to others. So there's no animosity here. This is just general in-house discussion amongst brothers. I also want to somewhat apologize to Gavin up front because I know this video that I'm about to respond to is a shorter or more condensed video of things he's addressed elsewhere and more links. So if he watches this, he may be thinking, hey man, I talked about this in more depth elsewhere. Yeah, I'm aware of that, but this video is short and sweet and allows me to keep my video short and sweet. So yeah, responding point by point to an hour-long video just scales my video production time significantly. So it might be lazy on my part, but this is what we're doing. No, I think my critiques here will apply to the more in-depth discussions as well. Okay, so that stuff out of the way, let's hop on in. For a very brief background, in the Old Testament, when God tells the Israelites to go into the land of Canaan, God uses really harsh language in his instructions. Essentially, the Israelites are to show no mercy, kill everything that breathes, and many have noted that this seems to meet the criteria of genocide. So what follows is a short video by Gavin summarizing some different responses to this genocide accusation. So let's just go ahead and roll the clip.
We can get fresh perspective about the conquest of Canaan by considering first, literary context, and second, historical context. Literary context simply means paying attention to how language works. Many scholars believe that biblical language about the destruction of the Canaanites involves ancient warfare rhetoric, which employed hyperbole in various ways. Thus, interpreted accurately, the Bible is not describing genocide or the wanton destruction of non-combatants. In other words, when we read these stories, we shouldn't envision the Israelites sweeping through residential areas to kill women and children. Rather, these passages are describing a decisive military victory in the ordinary language of the day. There are at least 5 reasons to take this proposal seriously.
Okay, so here we see Gavin start to set up the ancient warfare rhetoric approach that has been put forth by guys like Paul Copan, Inspiring Philosophy, so on and so forth. And the idea here is to say, hey, yeah, God said all this stuff, but he didn't really mean it literally. It's just hyperbolic. This has become an incredibly popular strategy, so let's go ahead and let Gavin continue to set up this argument.
First, warfare rhetoric is very common in the ancient world. Very frequently, language of total destruction or total annihilation is used to describe a decisive military victory, even in situations where we know that literally every person wasn't killed. We even find foreign powers using this language to describe Israel's destruction, yet obviously we know that not every Israelite was killed. Second, the same language of total destruction is used in the Bible to describe the Babylonian exile. But obviously we know that this event didn't kill all the Israelites.
Okay, so the first problem with this line of argument is pretty much all of the examples that Gavin just put on screen were examples in which the writer was looking back at an already completed action or already, completed war or whatever, and describing it as being totally destroyed, annihilated, so on and so forth. And if all we had were comparable statements about the Israelites, this argument might work, but unfortunately it doesn't because that's not all we have. With the Israelites, we don't just have people writing after an event in a descriptive manner that vaguely is saying everybody was destroyed. We have a person giving commands before the event takes place, and they are prescribing what needs to be done. These are two very different situations. Most ancient rulers will want to magnify their victories and minimize their losses to make them look good to their subjects. So it isn't surprising that we would find this type of language being used by writers in the ancient Near East to, describe their leaders' actions to make them look good. But with the Israelites, we don't just have instances in which they're vaguely describing past actions to make themselves look good. We have instances in which the Israelites are specifically specifically being told how they are to engage with the upcoming warfare that they're about to engage in. And in those instructions, they're explicitly told to leave nothing that breathes. If you want to draw a parallel between the ancient Near Eastern text and the biblical text, then you need better examples. You need better parallels. You need to show an instance in which some other commander told his army to completely kill everything that breathes, leave nothing alive, and that needs to be an instance in which the commander didn't actually want his troops to carry out that command literally. That would actually be comparable to what's going on in the Old Testament. To give you some idea of what we're looking at here, let's look at Deuteronomy 20. In this chapter, God begins by telling the people, hey, when you go out and you wage war with this group of people, you offer them peace first, and then if you go to war, you only kill the males and you can spare everybody else. You can spare the animals, the women, so on and so forth. But then after being told that the Israelites are told to, treat these guys this way, it turns and it says, okay, when you fight with these other guys over here, now you don't offer them peace first. That's a contrast, and you leave nothing that breathes. So there are two contrasts. You don't offer peace first, and you leave nothing that breathes. This command to leave nothing that breathes, it directly contrasts with the other command which came before it, which allowed for them to leave some alive. And there are instances in Scripture in which this type of language of killing everybody, leave nothing breathes. This type of rhetoric is used, and we know for a fact that it isn't just hyperbolic because the Israelites were rebuked for leaving stuff alive. So, for instance, in 1 Samuel 15, Saul is told to destroy the Amalekites, and he is told to kill all the men, women, infants, animals, all of them. And then Saul leaves some of the animals alive, and Saul gets rebuked for not faithfully obeying the Lord. He didn't kill everything that he was supposed to. This happens as well with the Midianites. When Moses gets mad that the Israelites spared the Midianite women and children, he then tells them to kill all the male children and to spare only the female that were virgins. So we see the explicit examples of this type of total massacre of enemy non-combatants in the Torah, and we have language in Deuteronomy which clearly indicates that they were to perform this type of destruction on the Canaanites. But finally, we can know that the Israelites understood that this was a literal command. It wasn't just hyperbolic, because the Torah records them killing non-combatants such as women. In Joshua 6, we are explicitly told that they went in and killed men and women, young and old, and they were to only spare Rahab and her family, who were some non-combatants in the city. In the Battle of Ai, we are explicitly told that all the men went to fight Israel out in the open, and then after all those men were killed, Joshua went back to the city and then killed all of the inhabitants there. And some of whom that were killed here, we know were women because it explicitly mentions women in the death toll, and it explicitly says all of its inhabitants were destroyed. Now, guys like Gavin, they want to use this strategy of, oh, at this point over here, this guy uses this phrase in a hyperbolic way, therefore I can just plug this hyperbolic idea in anytime I see this language used. And no, that's not how language works. You have to look at each instance, and the overwhelming evidence indicates that God told them in this instance to literally kill everything that breathes. That's what they were expected to do, and that's what they actually did. This was in contrast to how they dealt with other cities in which they are allowed to leave some alive, and that's how their actions are described in the text. So I think this argument by guys like Gavin, Copen, Inspiring Philosophy, I almost want to call it theological gaslighting. I mean, maybe not gaslighting in like the literal full sense of the word. I don't think they're like intentionally deceiving people and things like that. But I think it feels like when I hear this stuff, it feels like if I was an atheist, I would feel like maybe I was trying to be gaslit. Because the text is pretty clear, I think, in what it says. And for Christians to come along and say, and not just to say, oh, it doesn't actually mean that, but to say that it doesn't mean that, and sometimes to treat the atheists like they are being intellectually lazy, or they're not engaging in their proper research, or just kind of be rude or flippant with them for the fact that they're interpreting the text in the way that it obviously says. That's just not charitable, and I think as Christians and as apologists we should do better. So let's go ahead and look at the next clip.
Third, interwoven with the command to destroy the Canaanites is a command not to intermarry with them. Similarly, the conquest is also described as a driving out and dispossession. But why would intermarriage be a temptation if everyone is supposed to die? And who would there be to drive out?
Okay, let's talk about the command not to intermarry. So Gavin asked, why would this command be given? Well, because the Israelites have a pretty bad track record with sexual sins, and God maybe knew that this would be a temptation for them, so he is emphasizing, not to do that. If I had a son and I say to him, hey, you were to come straight home after school, don't go anywhere else, don't go to the arcade, don't go to the park, you come straight home. The fact that I told him not to go to the arcade, the fact that I singled that out, that doesn't somehow negate the fact that I told him to go nowhere else but to come straight home. But Gavin seems like he would want to pop up and say, well, actually, dear boy, clearly your dad didn't really mean to come straight home because if so, there would be no reason to tell you not to go to the arcade. That's silly. Now, when it comes to the driving out language, okay, sure, you can classify this as driving out, but they're still told in the cities to leave nothing that breathes. And I don't think saying that, they're driving them out, I don't think that would clear them from meeting the criteria of a genocide. So whether or not you say, okay, the point of this is to drive them out, that doesn't change the fact they're explicitly told to, when they come upon these cities, to leave nothing that breathes. So it may be that when they come to these cities and they attack him, it may be that there are some people who are driven out in the sense that they flee, they're unable to get away, or maybe other, inhabitants, other people in the country see that this is going on, and so they run away before the Israelites can get to them. However, not everybody is going to be able to get away. There are going to be inhabitants of these areas that are less mobile, and they're not able to flee. You're going to have the old, you're going to have the sick, you're going to have, children, infants, so on and so forth, who are simply not going to be able to be driven out. And the command that's given about them is to kill them, to leave nothing that breathes. So realistically, what we have here is there are going to be instances in which the Israelite people are going to come into these cities or come into these settlements, whatever you want to call them, and they are going to be coming upon women who are probably cowering in a corner. Maybe they're holding their young baby, and you're going to have Israelites driving swords into their stomachs or cutting off their heads, slitting their throats. So this doesn't cut it. You're not dealing with the text in a way that is going to be faithful to what is accurately depicted.
Fourth, repeatedly throughout Joshua and Judges, those utterly destroyed are still around in the later narrative. Even in specific cities, we're repeatedly told that there are no survivors, but then we find there are survivors.
Okay, this is a horrible argument. This is like saying, hey, Hitler didn't really try to exterminate the Jews because look, there's still Jewish people today. No, the fact that Hitler failed didn't undermine the fact that it was clearly his goal and that's what he was aiming for. And the same can be said for the Canaanites. But notice Gavin's logic. Apparently, in the universe that Gavin lives in, once everybody in a city is killed, nobody ever can move to that area to live in afterwards. Like, you don't think humans ever rebuild previously fallen cities? I mean, this is just really bad logic.
This applies even when we have merisms like man and woman, old and young. And it's also true for the Amalekites in 1 Samuel 15, who are completely destroyed, but then keep popping up over and over. This doesn't mean the Bible has errors. It simply means we're trying to interpret its language in the way it uses it. Fifth, scholars like Richard Hess have argued that the Canaanite cities targeted in Joshua 9 through 11 are not primarily residential centers, but military garrisons. Thus, they wouldn't be targeting the civilian population at large by attacking them, any more than the Allied soldiers would be killing every single person in Germany when they're advancing through Nazi territory at the end of World War II. Again, the language of complete annihilation is describing the results of a total victory and an overturning of power.
Okay, so a couple things need to be said here. Even if we grant these are military, settlements, that would not undercut the fact that there would still be non-combatants there. In Joshua, Rahab and her family are examples of of non-combatants, non-military people living in Jericho. In the fall of Ai, we are told that all of the soldiers are drawn out of the city, and then after the soldiers are defeated, the Israelites go into the city and kill those who are remaining there. If all of the fighting men had already left and been killed, which is what we're told happened, that means those who remain remained were likely children, women, maybe the elderly, so on and so forth. And we are explicitly told that women were killed in this battle. They are included in the death toll. And Randall Rouser makes, I think, a good point in his book that even in the modern world, in military outposts or settlements, there are often entire communities that live at a base or a fort. So to try and say, oh, well, this was just, a military outpost, these are just soldiers who were being killed, that's misleading. Randall also notes that while there is evidence that these locations weren't huge, bustling cities, archaeologically, which would be potentially a point in Gavin's favor, well, sometimes that same evidence cuts against the historicity of the Canaanite conquest narratives, which describes these as being big fortified cities with huge walls. So one can't selectively, draw on this data to argue in one's favor in one instance, but then ignore that data when it cuts against it and when it comes to the historicity of the Joshua accounts. I'm not overly familiar with all this data set, and this is just that last thing I said is kind of just a minor point that I'm tacking on that I think is worth bearing in mind.
For each of these points in my longer video on this topic. But please understand, this does not completely answer the question. This just helps us properly frame the question. We still need to ask, even if these wars were not targeted against non-combatants, how is it okay to invade another country and kill people? This is where historical context can help. We have to remember that the ancient world was a brutal place. There was no UN, no police, and no restraint to human cruelty. In the Old Testament law, we find warnings against the Canaanite practices of bestiality and child sacrifice by fire. The biblical rationale for the conquest of Canaan is not greed or vengeance or xenophobia. This is a weaker nation attacking a stronger one, and the stated purpose in the text is the judgment of evil.
Okay, so a couple of things here. So first, not all the people in these cities were engaging in these heinous evils. For instance, infants were not engaging in these evil acts. The animals were not committing these evil acts. As I've already noted, the Bible tells us explicitly about children being killed in similar type of military conflicts, and there is no reason to assume that did not happen here. It's also worth noting that some have objected to the moral characterization of the Canaanites as just, being people who were just rampantly running around wanting to bang everything that moves. Now, there's no doubt that the Old Testament ascribes great sexual sin to the Canaanites, but what's interesting is that in order to make this type of argument, you have to assume that the statements about Canaan are representative of, one, every person in the land, and two, that this is, including children, which seems a stretch, but more importantly, is this requires us to actually take these statements in the Torah as being literal depictions about, what Canaan was actually like. And here is where I find some degree of potential inconsistency. If the Torah says that God commanded the people to kill everything that breathes, oh, well, that's hyperbolic, that's not literal, and so on and so forth. But then if the Torah goes on and says the Canaanites, engaged in something like bestiality or these other sins, well, then all of a sudden, not only is that literal, it was apparently just rampant. Everybody was doing it. And this seems to be just selective cherry picking and choosing what is a literal description of events and what isn't. And I say we should be consistent. We have to, make up our mind. If you want to say that the Bible merely engages in ancient warfare rhetoric because, this type of language is similar with other texts, and so we shouldn't think this is literal. If the similarity of this language and this motif is in other ancient Near Eastern texts, if that's enough to dismiss this as ancient warfare rhetoric, well, then that might be then opening the doors for guys like John Walton to come in and say, well, hey, this language about the Canaanites, well, this actually resembles other ancient Near Eastern tropes about, the otherly barbarians and, depicting them as being really worse than they are, and so, things like that, which is a motif that he would point out we see in the ancient Near East. So we shouldn't think that these are actually, the Canaanites are as actually bad as the Bible depicted them. And in which case, if, Walton is right about that and you open the door for that, well, then now you're potentially losing your they were so darn evil defense. So put simply, if ancient warfare rhetoric is a good argument for saying that the commands to kill were not literal, isn't ancient Near Eastern tropes about the barbaric outsiders justification for thinking the Canaanites weren't actually as bad as they were depicted in the Bible? And I'm not denying, me personally, that the Canaanites were evil. I'm saying that the way this strategy is being employed in conjunction with the ancient warfare rhetoric argument seems to be potentially inconsistent. Now, I'll add here that what I think is funny about all of this is, so Christians, if we affirm the flood narrative, you're going to have to affirm that God killed a bunch of infants, toddlers, animals, so on and so forth, who did not have the ability to actually sin themselves. You're already committed to that. So why are you jumping through all of these hoops to try and get around what the text clearly states in the Torah? Like even if not a single kid, not if even if a single non-combatant was killed in all of the Canaanite conquest, you're still going to have to admit that God killed a bunch of, kids, babies, non-combatants, so on and so forth in the flood. So the one thing that you're desperately trying to avoid saying when it comes to the Canaanite conquest, you're still going to have to say that anyways. So let's just stop with the backflips and the ad hoc, use of hyperbolic language. Let's just stop with all the gymnastics and let's just admit that technically what God commanded would be either considered genocide or something quite close to genocide.
There's a significant moral difference between violence in general and violence inflicted within the framework of punishment for wrongdoing. For example, if your neighbor imprisons you in their house, that's wrong. But if a judge sentences you to prison, that is entirely different. This is the ultimate explanation for the conquest of Canaan, the reality of divine judgment. To put it as simply as we can, God is the creator and moral governor of the entire world. He has the right to intervene and put an end to oppression and violence. This judgment was not a knee-jerk reaction, but the response to an accumulation of evil and lack of repentance over centuries.
Now, I don't disagree with the claim that God can judge people. Like, I don't have an issue with that. But merely saying this doesn't solve all the potential problems that one might raise here. So, God would be one, killing a bunch of people who are too young to sin. He might arguably be doing this in a way that seems at odds with how God tells us we are supposed to treat our enemies. So, we're supposed to love our enemies and have mercy on them. Yet, God was so ruthless with the Canaanites, he had no problem going in and killing every animal, baby, child that was in the city as well. I mean, one could press this and say, listen, this isn't about God's ability to judge. This is about maybe inconsistencies in how God's character is depicted. Also, isn't God supposed to be a God who, doesn't punish the children for the sins of their fathers? And if the main reason for this conquest of the Canaanites was moral judgment and a bunch of, babies and kids are being killed, it doesn't kind of seem like, the Canaanite kids are being punished for the sins of their father? So there's more work that needs to be done here. I'm not saying this is a complete blind alley. I'm just saying this isn't enough. Like, yeah.
Nor is it an ongoing paradigm for other violent acts. It was a unique event in world history for judging evil, but also for advancing redemptive purposes through the nation of Israel and her coming Messiah. Ultimately, God's judgment is a good thing. Where would the world be if God didn't intervene to stop evil? How could we trust a God who doesn't do anything about the burning of infants?
Okay, so if I'm an atheist, the immediate question I'm going to ask is, so we can't trust a God who doesn't stop the burning of infants, but we can trust a God who commands stabbing them with swords, actively drowns them in a flood, and elsewhere says that he's going to allow babies to be, ripped out of pregnant mothers' wombs. Are you sure that's the argument you want to go with here? Like your argument is that God wants to save the baby so badly that he just has to, one sec, let me check my notes, kill all the babies?
But the amazing thing about the Bible is that God is also merciful. And in this light, perhaps the most interesting character in the story of the conquest of Canaan is Rahab the prostitute, because her story highlights that no one need suffer God's judgment. God is eager to make peace with anyone who desires friendship with him. This is the message of the whole Bible, of which Joshua is just one part.
Okay, so this is just, I think, bordering on blatantly deceptive. Probably not intentionally on Gavin's part, but no, this is just awful. So this gives the picture of, oh, the Canaanites didn't have to die. They could have just repented and turned towards God like Rahab did. Two big problems here. First, the Israelites were not to offer these cities terms of peace. That wasn't on the table. They were not, giving the Canaanites the opportunity to repent. This brings me to my second point, which is that the only reason Rahab wasn't killed is she bartered with the Israelites. She found a way to make herself valuable to them, and so she used that leverage as a way to escape death. This is why her life was spared. If she didn't have something the Israelites needed, if she hadn't have helped them, do you think they would have spared her? Because do you think she would have even been given the opportunity to repent? I don't. So this seems quite silly. So in response, I think it's in response to this type of argument, Randall Rouser makes the note that listen, even the Nazis used Jewish labor to get things done. So you can't go down this route. This is just I think a really deceptive line of argument. Alright, I'm going to bring this video to a close here. No doubt there's more that could be said. I want to reiterate that I'm a practicing Christian, and if you doubt that I'm a practicing Christian, go look at my channel. I have over 200 videos on this channel of me defending Christianity or articulating Christian doctrine. I just finished a doctorate in theology in which I offer a way for understanding the divinity of Christ in light of his humanity. I'm not saying all this because, girl, I'm a big dumb rebellious atheist who just hates God. I'm saying all this because this hyperbolic language defense, it's horrible. It's bad. I would love to explain this all away as it being hyperbolic. I think that'd be great. But I have to follow the evidence where it leads. So the way I see it, Christians have the following options. One, you can just deny that God ever said this stuff, and you can say this is all made up by the Israelites, it's not historical, so on and so forth. This is what guys like Randall Rouser and it seems like Greg Boyd do. I'm not a fan of that option. I'm not going to advocate that. I don't think that's the way to go. At least that's the way I lean towards. Option two, you can admit that God really did say this stuff and that he really meant it. And if you take this option, well, then we have two further options. We can try to explain why God acted in this way, or we can simply say, I don't know why God did this. Now, personally, I'm not terribly bothered by saying that I don't know why God did this because me not knowing why God did this doesn't undercut what I know of God from the work of Christ and from the other sections of Scripture. But let's suppose we do want to give an explanation for why God did this. Whatever that explanation is, I don't think the explanation can just be, oh boy, Canaanites were super big giga evil. Saying the Canaanites were evil doesn't explain why God wanted all the animals and children killed as well. If you want to go down, the given an explanation route, I think your best bet is to draw on the fact that in the Old Testament, God is at war with other spiritual beings. God is wiping out Nephilim. He's waging war against the hostile Elohims that are trying to corrupt Israel and draw them astray, and so on and so forth. And it may be that completely eradicating the Canaanite offers a defeat for these spiritual adversaries. It cripples them in a way which wouldn't come about unless they were truly and completely destroyed in the way that the Israelites are commanded to do. It may be that God didn't want to command the utter annihilation of the Canaanite women and children, but he did so because of the rules of engagement that he has committed himself to when operating with humanity and with the other Elohim. And what I just said, that's not a full answer. There's still a lot of questions that will come up if we go down that line of thought. But here's the thing. In order for Christians to start answering those other questions that, the stuff I just said would lead to, in order to start answering those, we have to admit that these other questions, these other answers we've been hiding behind are bad. They're off. Like, we can't start providing good answers until we recognize that the current answers that we've been given are bad, and that's what we need to do. And this whole it was just rhetoric. These are just bad answers, and I as a Christian don't find them convincing. I'm not surprised that many atheists or skeptics don't find them convincing. I can't blame them for that. So here's my plea to Christian content creators like Gavin, Inspiring Philosophy, so on and so forth. Let's own the fact that God said what he said, or at least God is depicted as saying, what he said. And it's not pretty, and I don't like it either. But here's the thing. I would rather admit that God said this and admit that I don't have a full-fledged answer for why. I would rather do that than just start tossing things out of Christian history merely because I don't like them, or committing myself to using arguments that even I don't find persuasive. And unfortunately, that's where I'm at here. I don't want to go the Randall Rouser, Greg Boyd, route and just say, well, I don't like this, therefore it's unhistorical. I think even setting aside moral concerns, setting aside, spiritual aspects, I think it's methodologically seems improper to dismiss something as being unhistorical just because I don't like it. That seems problematic to me. These rhetoric arguments I think they're just bad. Like they don't properly deal with the text. So let's work on this problem as Christians together. Let's build towards an actually good explanation together. That's my invitation to people who I think are on kind of both sides of this issue. Some people giving this rhetoric nonsense. Some people are just saying let's just throw it out the window. I say both of you guys, both of your arguments I think are bad. Let's actually deal with and try to work with what the text says, and let's try to not pretend it says something it doesn't. So at this point, I'm going to say something, something, something. Like, comment, subscribe. A quick update. I will be putting out an announcement about my new book that I'm planning to make available for free. That's going to be coming very, very soon. Hopefully within the next week or two. I am chomping at the bits to share it with you all, but I'm working on getting the ebook available for free, which I have to do a little bit of work around with Amazon to make that happen, and so that's what I'm currently waiting on. So yeah, if you've been following my channel for a bit and you know that I've was working on a doctorate and you're interested in my dissertation, which I've talked about before, very soon, that's what this upcoming book's going to be. It's going to be free. I look forward to sharing it with you all. Okay, I hope everybody has a good day. Take it easy.